Welcome to session number 20 of an introduction to biblical prophecy. I'm Dr. John McMath, and I'm joined by my friends in Italy and in the Philippines. We've been studying together in various topics of Bible and theology for about 3 years since the COVID panic hit the world. And now here we are in this introduction to biblical prophecies. Or biblical prophecy. It's significant, I think, then. The study of biblical prophecy is the last of the theological disciplines to be explored. Since the beginning of the church, everyone has known that questions about the end times are pretty important. But it always seemed that other things were more important. It's more important to define the triunity of God, more important to define the nature of the human and divine in Christ. It's more important to hammer out the meaning of salvation. And as a theologian, I get it. I really, really do. It's really only been the last 200 to 300 years then theologians have paid particular attention to the doctrines of the end times. And one of the things that makes it difficult to study prophecy is that so many of the prophets are found in the Old Testament and they wrote in Hebrew. Most theologians, most European and American theologians come through the seminary system to get their advanced degrees, and so they go to a university for a 4-year undergraduate degree. Then they go to a graduate seminary program for 3 or 4 years to get a master's degree. And during that time, it's very difficult to cover everything. You can't get it all, and many, probably most pastors with master's degrees and college professors have to choose between Greek for the New Testament and Hebrew for the Old Testament. By far, like 95% choose Greek for the New Testament. Because of that, many Christian theologians, Bible teachers, pastors, take their eschatology, their doctrine of the last things, almost entirely from passages in the New Testament. The New Testament assumes the Old Testament. The best place to start, if you want to understand biblical prophecy, is in the Old Testament, which is why we've spent most of our time in the Old Testament. The New Testament assumes the Old Testament, doesn't contradict it. And it adds some detail, but it assumes the beginning point of the Old Testament. When we started this sequence in biblical prophecy, I introduced the concept of the blessing and the curse. From the first chapters of Genesis, there was and there continues to be an understanding that God lays before us the possibility of blessing, of a prosperous and happy life with Him, and the curse for those who walk away from the principles of Scripture. There is the curse. Now, on the redemption level, that equates to heaven and hell. On the kingdom level, it's also something we introduce in Genesis, that comes out as the prosperity of a walk with God. Those who turn away from God are going to be unhappy and unconnected, and their lives will appear to have no real purpose. Those who, as believers, choose to walk with God are going to end up with things turning out well, the blessing, both here and in the world to come. The world to come is important. but God is also concerned about how life happens here. So biblical prophecy is a part of a much larger set of principles, and the blessing curse principle comes to its ultimate climax at the very end of time. So I've told you that the day of the Lord is terminology that we find in the Old Testament primarily. Paul does use it. We'll mention that here in a bit. But it is not a widespread concept in the New Testament. It's simply assumed in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you'll find the day of the Lord, the day of God's displeasure, the day of that day, in that day, in the last days. There's a lot of different ways of saying the same thing, but you can always see the same thing coming out. The day of the Lord is an end time sequence of events that culminates God's blessing for those who are his own and his curse on those who have walked away from him. Just as simple as that, really. And when we walk through the biblical prophets and look at how all of this works out, it's easy to focus on the concluding judgments, all these curses. We go to the book of Revelation and you find half of the world being wiped out with this and a third of the green grass burned up and so on. And it's easy to focus on the curses. The blessings, on the other hand, are a large part of the Old Testament predictions. And we find the culmination of that in the prophetic literature of the New Testament. But it's not the biggest of the emphases. The Old Testament is where we go for this. So today I'm going to introduce the blessing part of the day of the Lord. We've spent several weeks now hammering on the various curses on the world, curses on the nations, curses on Israel. Last week we spent some time thinking about the curses on Israel as a result of their intransigence, their hard-heartedness in the face of God's grace. We talked about the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people throughout the world. At first, they were the day of the Lord terminology respected a particular judgment coming, the Assyrians coming, or the Babylonians coming, or the Romans coming, perhaps. But the long-term notion is of an end of time culmination of the curse theme. So we see it in the book of Revelation. The people of Israel are there. They've come back from their dispersion, and now those who continue to reject the Lord will undergo the bad stuff of the tribulation period, while those who are walking with God will experience the blessing of the time. The dispensational approach to biblical studies allows us to make a distinction between Israel and the church, to see the two tracks that diverge in some places and come together in some places. The church has not replaced Israel in the plan of God. The church certainly is a fulfillment of much of Old Testament prophecy, and it is certainly God's primary mover of the redemption program in this age. But the church has not replaced Israel, and Israel continues to serve its part in the whole story. So at the end of time, there's a particular set of blessings, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Let me see if I can make the screen share. Yeah, this looks. There it goes. How about that? Everything seems to be working. Okay. For Israel and for the Jews in general, there's a future deliverance. For all of the other nations of the earth, there's a future deliverance. For all of creation, the entire universe, there is a future deliverance. And different parts of the Bible emphasize different bits of this. But we need to understand that a very common emphasis, particularly in the Old Testament, some 60 times, where the day of the Lord or similar expressions are used, refer to a future time when Yahweh would reestablish the fortunes of Israel and the Jewish people. It is also very clear, particularly in Isaiah, but also in Zechariah and some of the others as well, Micah, that the redemption of Israel will be joined by the redemption of other nations as well. And over in Hebrew or in Romans chapter 8, Paul speaks about the creation itself groaning until the final revelation of the children of God. So this is something that definitely the biblical authors were all looking forward to, and they reveal enough detail that we really ought to be able to put this together. Again, I'll mention that many modern Bible teachers do not get the whole story because they're really not competent in Old Testament studies. To understand the whole picture, you really have to spend some time in the Old Testament. So we're going to spend a bit of time in the Old Testament today, but let's look at some of this. One part of the prediction of future blessing that we find in a lot of places in the Old Testament. Isaiah does a lot of this, and Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They were looking forward to the return of the people of Israel, particularly the people of Judea, from their Babylonian captivity. And the return from the Babylonian captivity is seen by some, and again, this is, I know I'm being critical, but the Reformed tradition has a tendency to say that the predictions of the return of Israel from their dispersion was fulfilled in 535 BC when a small group of returning exiles came back to Jerusalem, began building the temple, which was a shadow of its former glory, began building eventually a wall around the city of Jerusalem to give it a certain amount of independence. It remained part of the Persian Empire, but the city was again a Jewish city. And to say that that's the fulfillment, that's what the prophets have in mind, is to misunderstand what the Bible actually says. By the time we get to places like Isaiah, Isaiah has a big impact on our understanding of the day of the Lord, and particularly the blessings of the day of the Lord. Isaiah speaks, Isaiah along with Ezekiel and Jeremiah speak of a time when the people of Israel will return to the promised land from everywhere, from all of the nations of the world. Now, when some of the Jews returned from Babylon in 535 BC, that wasn't all of the nations of the world, and it certainly wasn't the beginning of the promised kingdom age. It simply doesn't fulfill what the Old Testament calls for. And the return from the so-called diaspora began in the late 1800s, around 1870, 1880, with a secular movement that we call Zionism. Zionism is a movement amongst, at the time, European intellectuals who believed that the solution to the problems faced by the Jewish people out in the secular world could be relieved by a physical movement, a return of Jews to a homeland in Jerusalem and the countries, the neighborhood of Judea and Samaria. And in the late 1800s, it was obvious that the Ottoman Empire, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire is the last episode of the Islamic worldwide caliphate. That was slowly dying out. The people in the years before World War I recognized that the Ottoman Empire was not succeeding well. It was not doing what an empire ought to do, and it was gradually going to have to be replaced by something else. And the Zionist movement was a movement to make a homeland for the Jewish people in what is today modern Israel. The development of the state of Israel took not quite 100 years, about 80 years in the land. And the people gradually came in, they bought land. Groups of Jews would come from various places and they would buy land from the Arab landowners, usually absentee landowners in either Egypt or Turkey. And these absentee landowners sold land at very high prices and often unusable land, swampland, marshes and whatnot. And the stories of the early settlers moving into the land, fighting for years against the mosquitoes and the malaria and the difficulties, all the time under fire from the local Bedouin and other Arabs who didn't like the European and Russian newcomers to the land. Those stories are great stories. They deserve to be told, but that's not really where I'm going today. These folks at that time were the pioneers who came back to the land, began to plant small villages. Some were what we called a kibbutz, which is a kind of a communal ownership of farmland, sort of communism. A lot of these folks came from the areas of Eastern Europe and Russia, where a communist lifestyle was actually acceptable in the late 1800s. It was something that people wanted to do. That, of course, has not worked out very well in the modern world. And the kibbutzes of Israel are no longer communist. People own private property. And it just didn't work out. The other kind of settlement was called a moshav, which is it's not a collective. It's a secular farming community, a cooperative, where private ownership of land, but a cooperative ownership of the equipment and the facilities for making the land profitable. So the Moshav movement and the kibbutz movement allowed the return of relatively large numbers of Jews back to Zion. The movement is called Zionism. Those of us who believe that Zionism is a fulfillment of at least a portion of God's prophecies concerning the return of Israel to the land are often called Christian Zionists. And I think that's probably a misnomer. But I'm willing to run with it. I can go with that. I'm happy to see the Jewish people prospering in the land of Israel, because that's clearly a major theme of the Old Testament prophets. So let's look at next little bit, the blooming of the land. This is a picture of Haifa in the north of Israel, big, booming, hardworking industrial city with a port and factories, the whole works, freeways, you name it. It's all there. This is Isaiah, and there's a lot of blooming and blossoming that we're going to find in Isaiah. But this, speaking of the land of Israel, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. This particular photograph is taken from the top of Mount Carmel, looking north toward the mountains of Lebanon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Now, think about what Isaiah is seeing here. He's saying the people of Israel return from all over the world to the land of Israel, which will be blessed with a blooming and a blossoming, an abundant prosperity. And that's exactly what we see in the modern nation of Israel. Now, it falls short of the biblical promises still. It's not there. But the prosperity of modern Israel is a stark contrast to the other states in the area. Ask anybody if you'd rather live in say Damascus or Tel Aviv, and there's no contest. And the reason for that is that Islam as a whole does not produce material prosperity. Judaism, as practiced in Israel, does. Now, why is that? Well, part of that is because God has chosen to bless the people of Israel, even those who are not believers. And there's a difference between the blessing of redemption and the blessing of a prosperous and happy nation that results from following God's principles. And if there is a blessing for simply being obedient to God outside of the religious frame, how much more is Israel's final redemption going to make this a good thing? So I look forward to seeing what God will do. Now, another element of the return to Israel is the prophecy of continuing war. The people of Israel will come into the land and will rebuild the land and make it a prosperous place in spite of ongoing war. Jeremiah 14. Have you utterly rejected Judah? Does your soul loathe Zion? Why have you struck us down so that there is no healing for us? We looked for peace, but no good came. For a time of healing, but behold, terror. Okay, this return to the land, and as we look at Jeremiah, he's looking very much at this return, has been under a constant opposition since the beginning. And this opposition has been from the local cast of usual suspects, the surrounding Arab nations, who reject the possibility of a Jewish state alongside them. The rest of the world says, well, we insist on a two-state solution. The Arabs have, for roughly 100 years, rejected a two-state solution. They have said from the beginning, there is to be no Jewish state. We hate the Jews. We don't want the Jews anywhere near us. We have no interest at all in a Jewish state. We will continue to fight. And they have. They have. Every time I've been in Israel, I've noticed the possibility of war. The war is constantly with the Israeli people all the time. The modern war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip is a terrible thing. Nobody's going to say that that's a good thing, but it's been inevitable. The fact that Israel didn't go into the Gaza Strip and flatten the area 50 years ago is a wonder to all of us. Their amazing restraint ought to be the story, not the cruelty of Israel. The Jewish people have done their very best to try to make a prosperous place for the Arabs. We won't go through all of that, but the politics irritate me at times. We attack the Jewish people because they're fighting back against those who would bring them nothing but terror. And when we go back to October 7th and the attack on the Jewish kibbutzim in the south of Israel, the terror that was inflicted on Israel that day was horrendous. I'm not going to repeat all of that, but you know the stories. That's in stark contrast to Israel's way of making war. And we're not going to go there. The presence of war all the way to the end is a very important point. We've looked at the kinds of wars, particularly the end time wars that we've called Gog and Magog, Armageddon, and the War of the Three Kings, which may all be the same war or they may be different. It doesn't matter. The presence of war at the very end of time is a feature. It's not a bug. It's not something that has surprised God. This is part of what must take place, and it is predicted constantly in the Old Testament prophets. At the climax of the end time events, we're going to see the coming of the King, the arrival of the Messiah to rule from the Davidic throne. Let me reference here Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah is the most messianic book of the Old Testament prophetic corpus. We see Jesus as the virgin-born Son of God. We see him in Isaiah 9. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, the God-man. He is both wonderful and a counselor. He is mighty, full of miracles, and he is the God of reality, everlasting Father, Prince. God only knows we have plenty of princes about, but only one who will finally bring peace. That phrase is such an important part of our Christian heritage, and yet this mighty God, this Prince of Peace, is in fact the Jewish Messiah. He's coming to rule the world in fulfillment of the covenant to David. This is the 2 Samuel 7 passage that says, "Your son will rule on your throne forever." Well, when Jesus returns at the climax of a time of terrible trouble, he will restore the fortunes of Israel. That's the fulfillment of the kingdom blessings. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. When Jesus comes, he's going to initiate a rule that will last into the eternal state. I've been careful about how exactly I say that, because the kingdom age seems to have two parts. There's some significant differences between the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year kingdom on earth, and the eternal state. We see that very clearly in Isaiah, chapters 55 and beyond. We can see the messianic kingdom, and then we can see the eternal state. The difference appears to be the new heaven and the new earth with a new Jerusalem. Those are characteristics of the eternal state. The millennial kingdom is in the earthly Jerusalem, with the old earth still around, and with the Satan bound. So the devil is out of sight, and the world's system is no longer controlled by the devil. So you've got the world and the devil. There's nothing left but man and his sin nature. And there will be, at the end of the millennial kingdom age, there'll be a revolt against the Messiah, which will be put down again in a Gog and Magog-like war. And at the end of that, everything will be destroyed with intense heat, and God will rebuild heaven and earth for those that he has redeemed. So there's definitely a distinction between the millennial kingdom and the eternal kingdom, a relationship, but a distinction as well. The beginning of this multiple kingdom age is the second coming of Christ, which comes after the return of Israel to the land, which I believe could well have already happened, and the final wars. So the return to the land, final wars under the control of a terrible character that we call the Antichrist. And Christ will return at that point, and begin to rule over Israel from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. So this kingdom age is kind of an interesting thing, because it's based in Jerusalem. This is a photograph. That's Donna on the right, in case you couldn't tell, overlooking the hills just to the west of Jerusalem. This is the hotel where we were staying one year with a bunch of Moody students, and that area in the background will be the center of this worldwide millennial kingdom age. Jerusalem will be the place. Isaiah chapter 2. And it shall come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be the center of all the nations, and all the nations of the earth will come up to Zion to be taught by the Messiah. And there will be peace in those days. No longer will they make war. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. They won't learn to make war anymore. The United Nations has that little part of Isaiah 2 chiseled into the wall. They've forgotten all the rest of Isaiah, but they like that little bit. We're going to have peace. How can we do that? Peace in our time. We'll just do diplomacy and lots of secular stuff like solar power. Send John Kerry on his magical jet to bring peace and prosperity to the world. It's not going to happen. Messiah will reign from Jerusalem over a worldwide era of peace and prosperity, which is ultimately a test sometimes we say that this isn't the real thing. This is only a test. Sometimes a test is a fairly severe thing. The millennium is a test. What if the world, this present world, were perfectly governed? We in the West like to argue about who should be our political leaders. We'll vote for this one and we'll campaign for that one and we'll give money to this other one. And we say, well, all we got to do is elect the perfect premier or president or whoever, and that'll solve all our problems. And so far, that hasn't worked. There is no human government that has ever existed that can solve the problems of the world. It's going to take a miracle. And it's going to require that Messiah himself do something about it. And so now the question is it possible for Messiah himself on a perfect earth with no effects from the devil, with no effects left over from the world system, with no temptation to sin anywhere in the world, with nothing left but the human sin nature? Is that going to be possible? And what will happen is that there's a time of unmatched peace and prosperity. 1,000 years when the world comes into its fullest possible expression of good. And yet at the end of that time, we're told in the book of Revelation that Satan will be released from his imprisonment and he will lead astray. He will lead out against the Messiah a host of those who reject the truth, even in the face of the truth. We can today easily imagine that. So there will be a great war at the end of the millennial kingdom. And at that point, the final judgments will happen. Satan will be cast forever into a lake of fire. Death and sin will be cast into the lake of fire. The redeemed will enter then into the resurrection to the eternal state. So there's a big difference between the millennial kingdom and eternity. Again, some teachers who rely on the New Testament primarily overlook a lot of the details here, but the Bible's actually really clear when you start reading Old Testament as well. Isaiah 65, climax of Isaiah. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. Well, that's pretty clear. The New Testament talks about the same thing. When you get to the book of Revelation and the last chapters there, we're talking about a new heaven and a new earth. In the center of the new heaven is a new Jerusalem. So this is, heaven will continue to be a place where the Jewish people will have a central focus. This resurrection to the eternal state is ultimately the fulfillment of the Jeremiah 31 new covenant. I'm going to make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. No more will a man say, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the greatest to the least. When Paul says in Romans 11, and so all Israel will be saved. This is what he's looking at. And this eternal state will be a place for all of the redeemed, Jews and Gentiles alike, to live in peace together, prosperity together, in the presence of God, and ultimately in the absence of anything even resembling sin. None of the suffering will ever happen again. And it's that ultimately we look forward to. An important thing to understand here is that there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of blending of ideas. The biblical material itself is often a bit obscure. But when you look at enough of this, it's obvious what the pattern is doing. Let's look briefly at what the New Testament does with this. This is a picture from the Mount of Olives. It's a little dark in the background because I shot this at dawn, but you can see the Dome of the Rock in the middle of this thing. Matthew 24. Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, maybe in a place something like this. And the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they were even wondering about it then. They didn't get it. The apostles at the time of Christ in Matthew 24 really didn't understand that there would be a gap between his departure and the second coming to arrange for the kingdom age. They didn't get it. It would be a while before they did. But Paul and the other New Testament authors, but Paul in particular, clearly saw that Jesus was the king who was coming. And Paul understood that the church would be the revelation of a mystery, something that hadn't really been foreseen in the Old Testament, but would fill the time with the purpose of reaching the world with the Christian gospel. Now, this was not seen in the Old Testament. The apostles, and I suspect the very early Christians, recognized that Jesus was the Messianic King, and they expected a kingdom age very soon. Jesus, on the other hand, expected that the church would last for some time. We can see this particularly in the parables. Jesus talks about this spiritual or heavenly kingdom age, the church age, as a fairly long-lasting thing in which there is a mixture of some good and some evil. That there is a not ultimate perfection, but a long growing period. So the parable of the sower in chapter 13 of Matthew. The field is the world, the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. Okay, the weeds are the sons of the evil one. So we've got the good seed and the bad seed. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. So Jesus understood that this would be a long process, that there are going to be out in the world good seed, the sons of the kingdom. Those of us who are walking with the king and trying to be a blessing are the good seed. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. And anyone who argues that there is no evil in the world hasn't looked at the internet lately. Just read the news and tell me what part of that is the core of the blessing that you see everywhere. I don't. I see that we're in big trouble, and that the believing church exists in the midst of a much larger secular and anti-Christ world. And there's a harvest coming at the end of the age. The reapers are the angels, and the weeds are gathered and burned with fire. So it will be at the end of the age. There's a separation coming, but it is not yet. It is already established and already certain, but it is not yet. And so we're waiting. And Christ teaches that clearly. The mistake that we sometimes make is to assume that this kingdom age that we are in now, where Christ is in heaven and we are the disciples of the king in an evil world, that this is the fulfillment of the kingdom age. It's not. It's not. It's a development of the kingdom age. Paul has probably the clearest of the eschatological views of any of the apostles, except perhaps for John, if we can call the book of Revelation clear. But Paul saw the day of the Lord. It's a time that begins with trouble and with war, which is orchestrated by the Antichrist, but which is followed by the kingdom age. So you get this tribulation period, this trouble period, followed by the kingdom age of great blessing. This is the same pattern that we saw studying the book of Daniel. 69 weeks, then a parenthesis, a 70th week, followed by the second coming of Christ, the millennial age, and then the new heaven and the new earth. The biblical pattern is reiterated over and over again. Paul in Second Thessalonians 2 says it this way: that day, the day of the Lord, will not come. The people in Thessalonica had become convinced by some false teachers that the day of the Lord was already underway. And Paul says, don't worry about it yet. That day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. The rebellion, apostasia. There's going to be an apostasy first, a great departure from the faith. And I think an awful lot of eras of the church have had believers convinced that this is it. This is the great apostasy. How much worse can it possibly get? And today we wonder, how much worse could it possibly get? We don't have any idea. And yet this is not the end quite yet. It's very easy to make a list of the apostasy and the rebellion in the Christian world today. So when will it have reached its peak? Well, we don't know, and that's the point. And don't know means don't know. And we can make a good guess, perhaps, but we will only find out if we're right after it has happened. You can never know before. So the rebellion will come. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. In Daniel, he is the willful king, the man who rises up at this time to take his place against every sort of god, the who we sometimes call the Antichrist, although the New Testament only ever speaks of the spirit of Antichrist. So it's probably not the best name for him, but it's as good a name as we've got. So the rebellion will come, the Antichrist will be revealed, who will oppose and exalt himself against every so-called God or object of worship, and he will take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. This is what Antiochus Epiphanes did in 167 BC, kicking off the Maccabean revolt. If you're around Jewish people anywhere, you know that this is the period of the year we call Hanukkah, a celebration of the conclusion of the Maccabean revolt. And that's a whole different story, and we're not going to go there, but that's Antiochus Epiphanes. 2,000 plus years ago, that happened. Paul, during his lifetimes, looking forward to the future, he says this has not come yet. And this Antichrist character will take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. The temple, Paul also knew from Jesus' teaching, would be destroyed. That happened in 70 AD. And to this day, there is no temple. So the Antichrist cannot take his seat in the temple of God today. Can't happen. The temple is going to have to be rebuilt. That means that before the day of the Lord can come, the people of Israel are going to have to be back in the land. There's going to have to be an agreement of some kind of international agreement. The United Nations and the Arab Muslim world is going to have to agree that a temple can be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Unless that happens, there cannot be an Antichrist seated in the temple of God. So everyone that the people have thought has to be the Antichrist can't have been, because there's no temple. This has to be there first. And again, what we're doing here is looking at specific details. And my understanding is that these details need to make sense in their larger package. So we're looking for the end of the age in a time of trouble, in a time of war, orchestrated by the Antichrist, but followed by the kingdom. Okay. Book of Revelation is a fairly important book, and we're actually going to take time to walk through the whole book of Revelation eventually. This photograph is taken from when was that? Was this thing made? Back in the 70s, I think. The movie Apocalypse Now was made, and here come the helicopter, chop, 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 chop. A lot of people think the apocalypse is all about wars and rumors of wars. It's actually about the revealing of Christ himself. And the most important thing that happens is the second coming of Christ to establish the kingdom age. The book of Revelation can only be understood in terms of the day of the Lord concept, which is laid out by the prophets, and the chronological structure of the book of Daniel. It's the only way it makes any sense. This structure looks something like this, and sometimes I can get my graphics to work good. In this case, it's the best I can do. The New Testament prophetic outline is obviously built on this Old Testament model. There's the cross around 30 AD. At the end of time, the 70th week of Daniel, the 7 of the tribulation period, takes place. This includes Israel already returned to the land, a temple rebuilt in the land in Jerusalem, and Antichrist reigning over whatever area. And I think that's controversial. The beginning of that 70th week is predicted by Paul to be signified by the rapture of the church. The church has no place in the 70th week. We'll talk about that later. I'll show you how that works out. But the church simply doesn't need to be there. God is going to be going back to something of an Old Testament economy during that 70th week. And during that time, all kinds of horrible things will happen. This is a final judgment on the earth. But in the midst of it, God knows his own and will deliver them. At the end of that time, Christ returns to set up the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, which is again just the last of several tests to demonstrate that apart from the grace of God alone, salvation is not possible, and the blessings of peace and prosperity are impossible to achieve. We have to walk with God if we're going to be a blessing in the world. So a summary of some of this stuff. Let's see how much of this makes sense. The day of the Lord is the end time conclusion of the curse and blessing motif that we saw began in the book of Genesis. Simple test. See that fruit? Just don't eat that. Anything else in the whole world, go anywhere, do anything at all in the whole world, just don't eat that fruit. Simple test. It should have been really easy. And in response to that, Adam and Eve made the bad choice and that begins the entire sequence of curse, which is going to be reversed by the redemption program and the kingdom program, running concurrently all the way through the rest of Scripture. The curse portion culminates in the 70th week of Daniel, the judgment on the nations and on unbelieving Israel. The blessing portion of this motif is the millennium, a fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, and the eternal state and all that it entails. So we're coming to a conclusion. And the biblical pattern is looking always toward this conclusion. Everything up to that point is important, but it's not climactic. The climax is yet to come. That's pretty much that's the principle. That's what we're ultimately heading for. So I'm going to unmute us all. We're going to take 4 Wednesdays off. We'll be back in January, and at that point, we're going to pick up with some stuff. I want to get into the New Testament. I want to look at Jesus in the parables and in the Olivet Discourse. I want to spend some time looking at the concept of the kingdom age, and ultimately I want to finish up by looking at the book of Revelation in some detail, maybe not as much detail as we'd all like, but I want to take a more careful look at that as well. So we've still got a bit to go, and this should keep us busy well into the spring. So I'll see everybody again on the 17th of January. Thanks for your participation. I appreciate all of you guys. I can't tell you how much I like this, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye bye. Ciao ciao.
Ciao a tutti. Ciao a tutti.
Ciao a tutti.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Bye bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for
Thank you,
coming,
Dr.
guys.
John.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
bye.
Merry
Bye,
Christmas,
guys.
everyone.
Merry Christmas,
Merry
and have a good New Year celebration. I hope everybody can get together with family. Okay. Blessings. Bye bye, guys.